Hi, this is another short video in the Random Linux Stuff playlist. This one's on socket-based secure shell activation. And it's pretty straightforward. We will see what it is and how it differs from the SSHD service we know, and to show how to set it up, we'll do a small demo. Let's first look at the SSHD environment that most of us are familiar with. For quite some time now, the SSHD service can be started at boot time by enabling it using systemctl enable sshd.service. And it can be manually started and stopped anytime you like by using systemctl stop and systemctl start. At startup time of the service, a listening socket is also created, very often on port 22. The downside of starting SSHD as a service is that the time the system needs to boot largely depends on the number of services that have to be started. So the fewer services that have to be started, the faster the boot process will be. Another downside is that every process that you run takes memory space. To be honest, SSHD does not take a considerable amount of memory, but still, if it's running without actually doing something, it can be regarded as wasted memory space. Now the solution for this is socket-based secure shell activation. This means that instead of starting the SSHD daemon and a listening socket, only a listening socket will be created, which is a lot faster than starting a complete service. And also it only takes a few kilobytes of memory instead of multiple megabytes. This new situation means that no SSHD is running until the socket receives a connection request. Only then will the SSHD be started just for the period of that particular session. And when a second request arrives, a second root session will be created. And when users log off, every session that is no longer needed will exit. And with regards to the configuration of SSHD, the sshd_config file in /etc/ssh is used in both the old situation as in the new, with only a little difference. The listening port is determined either by the SSHD service or by the SSHD socket, depending on which of the two you start. Now let's see how this works. Let's first check the SSHD service. We see that the service is up and running. It uses a couple of megabytes of memory, and we see that the SSHD daemon is running and listening to requests. And to double check, we list the processes, and indeed we see that SSHD is running and listening for requests. And of course we can see our own SSH connection. Next thing we do is we disable and stop the SSHD service. And when we list the contents of the SSHD socket file in the system directory, it tells us that it conflicts with the SSHD service, which simply means that it will stop the minute the SSHD service would be started. And also the port used will be 22, which is the default, obviously. Now let's enable and start the SSHD socket. And when we check its status, it tells us that it's active and listening on port 22. It only takes 8 kilobytes of memory and no SSHD daemon is running. So the only thing there is the listening socket. And when we check the processes running, we only see our own session and no SSH daemon listening for new connections. Now let's make sure that both services behave the same, just because we can. So what we'll do is we'll also add the conflicts entry to the SSHD service file, so that it will be deactivated when we start the SSHD socket. So we'll add the conflicts line to the SSHD service unit file and do some testing. We do a daemon reload because we changed the unit file. We check the status of the SSHD socket and see it's up and running. Now we start the SSHD service, which will result in the deactivation of the socket, which was the default. So when we list the status of the SSHD socket, we see that it's inactive and dead. This is because of the conflicts entry. We check and see that the SSHD service is up and running, but now we start the SSHD socket and expect the SSHD service to be deactivated because of our conflicts addition. So we check whether the SSHD socket is up and listening, which it is, and when we check the service, it is inactive and dead. So we've made them mutually exclusive, as it is so nicely said. So we're happy and we're done.